We very much welcome, we would very much welcome the report on the findings on the European consensus, which are very much in line with the conclusions of our own research and evaluations. I think that the report in particular correctly identifies a need for better understanding and awareness of humanitarian principles amongst other parts of governments, including, I'm sure, the European External Action Service. They're very much in line, these recommendations, with the recent review commissioned by the British government of their humanitarian emergency response, and thus the topic that we have is very, very relevant today. Why is the topic important? My organization, DARA, produces an annual review of humanitarian donor performance against the principles of good humanitarian donorship. This, in essence, seeks to ensure, amongst other things, that assistance is based on need alone, and indeed it follows the key principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence that our chair has just alluded to. Our conclusion of last year's report of the year 2010 was that politicization and instrumentalization of aid is an increasing problem. 10 indeed of the 14 countries that we studied showed signs that humanitarian assistance had been subordinated to other objectives by either donor governments or host governments or other actors. These are on the basis of on-site, in-country reviews with the key partners of the donors themselves, non-governmental partners, and the UN agencies. A major concern has been that militarization of aid, especially in conflicts, and the potential negative consequences in terms of access, protection, the safety of civilians and humanitarian workers. This mixing, for example, in Afghanistan, puts humanitarian workers very specifically at risk. It's encouraging that some governments have taken a clear stance on the need to protect and preserve humanitarian space and promote humanitarian principles, such as this Parliament, by adopting the report, and the UK and other governments. If I may just comment briefly on the EU, I do want to commend the work of ECHO, which has been a consistently good donor in terms of respecting and promoting the fundamental humanitarian principles of allocating aid on the basis of needs, maintaining a strong stance on neutrality, impartiality, and independence of humanitarian aid, separate from other objectives. ECHO is not alone, I'm pleased to say. Most other European government humanitarian aid departments do try to apply these concepts and principles of good humanitarian donorship. But other parts of governments can and often do undermine this principled approach and misuse humanitarian assistance as a means to show their concern in a crisis, but their engagement is obviously sometimes superficial, lacking long-term commitment to the problem. This, in many cases, is due to a lack of understanding of why the particularity of humanitarian assistance and the unique role that it plays, and why the midterm review conclusions of the need to engage parliamentarians, agencies, the military and civil society, as mentioned by our chair, is so important. If we look at the specific issue of civil-military coordination, these are not necessarily incompatible. Indeed, the military often have an important role, but this, of course, depends on the circumstances. It is nonetheless essential that one ensures there's a clear distinction between the military and the humanitarian actors, and that any use of military assets should be military assets for humanitarian assistance should be when civilian assets are not available, as a last resort, usually, and always under civilian leadership. This is an issue we have seen in our field research in the Humanitarian Response Index, and is obviously worth underlining how important it is. Blurring the lines between political and military and humanitarian objectives and actors can have a devastating effect on ensuring protection and assistance to people affected by conflict and disaster, and, of course, the aid workers again. The case of Afghanistan speaks for itself. There are, of course, different militaries. We have national militaries that, and I don't include in here the militias. You have national militaries of host countries of such crises. You have international forces, be they single government forces, mandated or otherwise or not mandated by UN Security Council resolution, and then you have UN peacekeeping missions. There are a set of guidelines I think many of you will be familiar with, the Oslo guidelines and the more updated relating to conflict guidelines on military and civil defense assets, which were negotiated under UN auspices, which give a framework for this kind of cooperation. I haven't much time to go into that, but I do want to cite a number of examples of the different use here. One is in what is being alluded to as natural disasters, where local or national military assets, such as in Pakistan, are used with very good effect, with the importance of their logistic capacity and their ability to be on the ground. Pakistan floods is a good example. There have been other support alluded to by our chair, where international forces have played a role. Haiti is an example, the Asian tsunami. Where it gets a bit more complicated, of course, is where we're dealing with conflict, with complex emergencies. Sometimes you have a UN-sponsored force which have a clear mandate to ensure security and protection of civilians, such as in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the importance of training and broadening understanding of their obligations to protect are vital. Physical protection, after all, is a normal military role. Distribution of humanitarian supplies is not. Conflict, where the parties to the conflict, and be it the government or rebels, do not respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, or external military actors actually contribute to making the situation worse for civilians and humanitarians, are the kind of concerns that many of us have, where the space for neutral, impartial action is undermined, and the example here, again, I'm afraid, is Afghanistan. Clearly, in addressing humanitarian assistance and the needs, the fundamental issue must be what are the priority needs of the affected population. Our objective has to be the effectiveness of our aid for the people in need. That must be the touchstone. This should not be supply-driven. Secondly, what we need to sort out the best means to achieve our humanitarian objectives. Usually, the UN, the NGO community, the Red Cross have adequate capacity. But there are cases where a military role can be useful, but one needs to be very clear, as I've tried to indicate earlier, on the context. I think there is a concern here of how developments may evolve in relation to Libya. The potential here for mixing a political objective and humanitarian assistance. It's very important the actors understand their roles. In some crises that we've studied, of course, some governments have explicitly looked to their military to raise their profile and generate goodwill, win hearts and minds, or indeed link this to counterinsurgency, stabilization, or other military aims. These are not humanitarian objectives. Other forms of instrumentalization that we have encountered beyond these kind of links are the prioritization by donors of state building and economic development to the detriment of addressing direct humanitarian needs, such as in Colombia, in Somalia, uncritically funding and supporting recipient governments' agendas, even when state actors are wholly or partly responsible for humanitarian crises, such as Zimbabwe and Colombia, or indeed, as is so often seen, using aid as an instrument to build, I could say, buy goodwill or meet domestic concerns tied often to former colonies. For the Parliament and Member States, it is really vital to recognise the legitimate concerns of their humanitarian agencies and ensure that other work it doesn't inadvertently accentuate the crisis. And this, of course, requires greater coordination at higher level. I do not have time to go into now the many governments and host governments and non-state actors in crisis-affected countries themselves who also politicise or seek to politicise humanitarian assistance. I need to conclude. Support for aid based on humanitarian principles is vital, not only on the basis of principles, because that's the way it works. The role of the European Parliament and Member States should be to strongly advocate for the respect and implementation of international humanitarian law and principles by all parties, including rebel groups, and to ensure that diplomatic efforts support the work of humanitarian actors on the ground. At the end of the day, the effectiveness of our assistance to those in need is the most vital aspect. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mountain.